The Limoges porcelain shattered against the far wall, taking a $4,000 truffle risotto with it. Silence swallowed the massive bedroom, the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that follows a gunshot. I stood by the heavy mahogany doors, clutching a deep red linen napkin to my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs. Donatella Moretti was dying. She lay in the center of a bed that was too large for her, her once commanding frame now fragile, her skin the color of old parchment. She hadn't eaten in 12 days, not a single bite. Next to her bed stood her son, Don Silas Moretti. He was a man who owned the city, a man who could make politicians disappear with a single phone call, and right now, he looked entirely powerless. His dark eyes flicked from the ruined risotto on the wall to the trembling, furious form of Chef Henri, my boss. Silas didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He simply took a step forward, the tailored lines of his dark suit shifting flawlessly over his broad shoulders, and the air in the room grew instantly, terrifyingly cold. "I paid you $50,000, Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "to make something she would eat. You made her mud." "Don Moretti, please," Chef Henri stammered, backing away. "The truffles were flown in from Alba this morning. It is a masterpiece. Get out." Silas didn't even look at him. His gaze was fixed on his mother, who had turned her face away from the smell of the rich food. Henri scrambled toward the door, practically shoving past me. I didn't move. I should have felt terror. Instead, it felt like an opportunity. I reached into the pocket of my deep red apron and pulled out the one thing I had brought with me to this fortress of a mansion, a tarnished silver soup spoon. My grandmother's. Its weight was a comforting anchor in my palm. While Henri had been shaving truffles, I had been simmering a pot of brodo down in the cavernous kitchen, a simple bone broth with tiny pastina stars. I stepped forward, stepping out of the shadows and into the amber light of the bedroom. I felt heavy, solid, and utterly grounded. Silas turned his dark, dangerous eyes on me. "I said get out," he growled. "No," I replied, my voice steady. "I have something she'll actually eat." I was 33 years old, and my life existed entirely in a windowless basement. I was the lowest-ranking prep cook at Il Tartufo, the only 3 Michelin-starred Italian restaurant in the city. My days were measured in pounds of peeled garlic, gallons of clarified butter, and the relentless screaming of Chef Henri. I worked 14-hour shifts. My feet ached constantly. My thick thighs chafed in the stifling heat of the kitchen, and my curves, which my grandmother always said were a sign of health and prosperity, were just something else for Henri to mock when he was in a foul mood. "You take up too much space, Clara," he would bark, shoving past me to inspect a line cook's plating. "Move your heavy self out of the way." I never argued. I never talked back. I just kept my head down and my knife moving. Because despite his cruelty, Henri needed me. He didn't know how to balance acid and fat. He didn't understand the alchemy of salt. He built dishes meant to look like abstract art, but they tasted like nothing. Whenever a sauce was flat, whenever a reduction lacked depth, he would call me over. I would pull my grandmother's tarnished silver spoon from my pocket, dip it into the pot, and tell him exactly what was missing: a drop of vinegar, a pinch of sugar, a bruised sprig of thyme. I had a gift. My palate was perfect. I could taste the soil the tomatoes were grown in. I could taste the mood of the butcher who cured the pancetta. My grandmother, Nonna Rosa, taught me that food wasn't about impressing people. It was about anchoring them to the earth. "Food is memory, Clara," she used to say, stirring a bubbling pot of ragu on her ancient stove. "If you cook with your ego, you feed their pride. If you cook with your soul, you feed their blood." I lived by those words, but in the basement of Il Tartufo, there was no room for soul. There was only precision, tweezers, and edible gold leaf. I was drowning in a sea of pretension, waiting for a life that felt like it would never start. Until the phone rang, until the Moretti family demanded the best chef in the city. Henri had panicked. He knew his food was soulless. He knew he needed an insurance policy. So, he had grabbed me by the arm, shoved me toward the service elevator, and told me I was coming with him. It was the moment my life fractured into a before and an after. The Moretti estate was a fortress carved out of the rocky cliffs overlooking the ocean. We arrived in a fleet of black SUVs. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. The air smelled of salt, pine, and barely contained violence. Henri was sweating through his pristine white chef's coat before we even reached the front doors. I, on the other hand, felt oddly calm. I smoothed my hands over my deep red apron, the fabric clinging to the dip of my waist and the flare of my hips. I belonged in kitchens, no matter who owned them. We were escorted to a kitchen that was larger than my entire apartment. It was a masterpiece of stainless steel, black marble, and copper pans. But it felt cold, sterile, like a morgue. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit was waiting for us. He introduced himself as Leo, Silas Moretti's right hand. The Don's mother, Donatella, is upstairs, Leo said, his voice flat. Her husband passed away 3 weeks ago. She hasn't eaten a full meal in 12 days. The doctors say if she doesn't eat soon, her organs will begin to shut down. They've tried IVs. She pulls them out. I have prepared a menu, Henri interrupted, holding up a leather-bound folder. Pan-seared foie gras, a delicate white truffle risotto, and I don't care what you make, Leo said, stepping into Henri's space. I care that she eats it. If she dies, the Don will be displeased, and you do not want to see him displeased. Henri swallowed hard. He immediately started barking orders at me. Chop this, boil that, fetch the caviar. I ignored the caviar. I went straight to the massive walk-in refrigerator. I bypassed the imported Wagyu and the lobster tails. I found what I was looking for in a humble plastic bin in the corner. A whole chicken, some rustic carrots, celery, and onions. If a woman is starving herself to death from grief, she doesn't need foie gras. She needs a reason to stay alive. She needs a tether to the world of the living. I began to chop. The heavy thud of my knife against the wooden block was the only sound I focused on. I was building a spell, ingredient by ingredient. But as I dropped the chicken bones into the massive stock pot, I knew the real danger wasn't the cooking. It was the man waiting upstairs. The man who would decide our fate based on a single bite. I paused, holding my grandmother's spoon over the simmering water. If you had to choose between cooking for a ruthless mafia boss to save his mother, or escaping into the night to chase your own dreams, what would you do? Drop a comment below right now. His kitchen or my restaurant. Make your choice, because Clara's life is about to change forever. The next 3 hours were a masterclass in culinary arrogance. Henri constructed his truffle risotto like a fragile monument to his own ego. He fussed over the placement of every microgreen. He shaved the Alba truffles with trembling hands. Perfect, he whispered, staring at the plate. It is a triumph. I looked at the dish. It was technically flawless. It was also utterly devoid of life. It smelled like wet dirt and desperation. You should let me bring up the brodo, I said quietly, stirring my massive pot in the back corner of the kitchen. The broth had been simmering for hours, reducing down to a liquid gold that smelled like Sunday afternoons in Sicily. Henri whipped around, his face purple with rage. Shut your mouth, Clara. You are a prep cook. You are nothing. You chop the onions. You do not speak to me of your peasant water. He grabbed the silver tray bearing his masterpiece and marched out of the kitchen, flanked by 2 armed guards. I didn't stop stirring. I just closed my eyes and let the scent of the brodo wash over me. It was rich, savory, and deeply comforting. I dipped my tarnished silver spoon into the liquid, blew gently to cool it, and took a taste. Perfect. It needed nothing. It was ready. 10 minutes later, the screaming started. I heard a crash from upstairs, a deep, roaring voice that vibrated through the floorboards. Henri came sprinting back into the kitchen a few moments later, his face the color of spoiled milk. "He's crazy," Henri babbled, grabbing a towel and wiping his face. The old woman threw the plate. "The Don, he pulled a gun on me. He said I have 5 minutes to leave his property, or he will bury me in the garden." "Then you should leave," I said, my voice calm over the simmering of my pot. Henri looked at me like I had lost my mind. "We are leaving. Grab your knives." "No," I said, reaching for a simple, deep white porcelain bowl. "I'm not finished working." Henri fled. The heavy kitchen doors swung shut behind him, leaving me completely alone in the massive space. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle bubbling of the brodo. I ladled the golden liquid into the bowl. The tiny pastina stars settled at the bottom. I didn't add truffle oil. I didn't add gold leaf. I added a single sprig of fresh parsley and a dusting of grated Parmigiano Reggiano. I placed the bowl on a simple wooden tray. I laid a crisp white linen napkin beside it and carefully rested my grandmother's tarnished silver spoon on the cloth. I picked up the tray and walked out of the kitchen. The hallways of the Moretti estate were dark, lined with old portraits and heavy tapestries. The air felt suffocating, thick with unspoken threats and impending death. I followed the grand sweeping staircase up to the second floor, the scent of the brodo preceding me like a herald. As I reached the landing, the armed guards outside the master suite moved to block my path. "Halt," one of them said, putting a heavy hand on my shoulder. I didn't flinch. I looked him dead in the eye. "I have food for the Don's mother. Move." The guard hesitated, his nose twitching as the scent of the broth hit him. It was a smell that bypassed logic and went straight to memory. The scent of a mother's kitchen, the scent of home. Before the guard could argue, the massive bedroom doors swung open. Silas Moretti stood there. He was taller than I expected, broad-shouldered and radiating a dark, lethal energy. His eyes were bloodshot, his tie loosened, his jaw tight with fury and despair. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I'm Clara," I said, holding the tray steady. "And I made something she will actually eat. Now step aside, Don Moretti, before it gets cold." I should have felt terrified to speak to a mafia boss that way. Instead, I felt like a queen demanding passage. Silas stared at me. No one had ever spoken to him like that. I could see the muscles in his jaw ticking, the violent impulse warring with his desperate need to save his mother. His dark eyes dropped to the tray in my hands, then dragged slowly up my body, taking in the curve of my hips beneath the deep red apron, the fullness of my chest, and finally, my face. He didn't look at me with disgust, the way Henri did. He looked at me like he was trying to figure out if I was a threat or a miracle. He stepped aside. I walked into the bedroom. The air smelled of sickness and old perfume. Donatella was still staring at the wall, ignoring the mess of the ruined risotto. I approached the bed. I didn't announce myself. I didn't present the dish with flowery language. I simply placed the wooden tray on her lap and sat down on the edge of the mattress. "Signora," I said softly, my voice a low, soothing hum, "you must be very tired." Donatella didn't move, but her eyes flicked toward me. "I brought you something," I said. "It's just brodo, my Nonna Rosa's recipe. I made it for you." The steam rose from the bowl, curling through the cold air of the bedroom. Donatella inhaled. I saw the imperceptible stiffening of her shoulders. Her eyes widened, just a fraction. She looked down at the bowl. Then, she looked at the tarnished silver spoon resting on the napkin. I picked up the spoon. I dipped it into the golden broth, capturing a few tiny pastina stars, and held it out to her. "Just one taste," I said, "for your son. He is very worried about you." Silas stood frozen at the foot of the bed, not even breathing. Donatella's trembling hand reached out. She didn't take the spoon from me. She just leaned forward, her dry lips parting. She took the broth from my grandmother's spoon. She closed her eyes. A single tear slipped down her pale, lined cheek. "It tastes," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves. "It tastes like my mother's kitchen in Palermo." She reached out and gripped my wrist, her fingers shockingly strong for someone so fragile. She pulled the spoon toward her again. Over the next 20 minutes, Donatella Moretti ate the entire bowl, every drop of broth, every pastina star. When she was finished, she leaned back against the pillows, a faint flush of color returning to her cheeks. "Thank you, Clara," she murmured, closing her eyes. A moment later, she was asleep. A deep, healing, restful sleep. I picked up the empty bowl and the silver spoon. When I turned around, Silas was staring at me. The terrifying Mafia Don looked entirely unmade. "My office," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Now." Silas's office was a dark, masculine sanctuary of leather, mahogany, and shadows. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, his back to me. His broad shoulders rose and fell with a heavy breath. "She hasn't spoken a complete sentence in 2 weeks," he said, turning around. "And she hasn't eaten a full meal in almost as long. The best doctors in the country told me to prepare for a funeral." He walked toward me, stopping just inches away. I had to tilt my head back to look into his dark eyes. He smelled of expensive cologne, gun oil, and pure power. "What did you put in that soup?" he asked quietly. "Chicken, carrots, celery, onions, water, salt," I replied, holding my ground. "That's it?" "And time," I said, gripping my silver spoon in my pocket, "and respect for the ingredients. Chef Henri cooks for the camera, I cook for the soul." Silas studied my face. "Henri is gone. He will never work in this city again." I nodded once. "Good. He was a tyrant who couldn't balance a sauce to save his life." A ghost of a smile touched Silas's lips. It transformed his harsh face into something devastatingly handsome. "I am hiring you," Silas stated. "It wasn't an offer, it was a command. You will live here. You will be my mother's personal chef. I will pay you triple whatever Il Tartufo was paying you, plus $100,000 signing bonus. Your only job is to keep her eating, keep her alive." It was an impossible amount of money. It was freedom. But I knew exactly who this man was, and I knew what happened to people who became his property. "I accept," I said, my voice ringing clear in the silent office. "But on my terms." Silas's eyes narrowed. "Your terms." "My kitchen," I said, pointing a finger at his broad chest. "No guards inside. No interference. I order the ingredients, I inspect the deliveries, and nobody touches my pots. If you want me to save her, you let me work. But I am not one of your soldiers, Don Moretti. I am the chef." For a long moment, Silas didn't speak. The silence stretched, taut and dangerous. I should have felt like I pushed too far. Instead, it felt like I had finally taken control of my own life. Then, Silas nodded slowly. "Agreed," he rumbled. "Welcome to the family, Clara." The next 3 weeks fell into a strange, beautiful rhythm. I took absolute control of the kitchen. I banished the sterile, modern feel and filled the space with life. Baskets of fresh heirloom tomatoes on the counter. Bunches of basil and oregano hanging from the copper racks. The constant, comforting smell of roasting garlic and rising dough. Donatella began to heal. Every day, I brought her something new, built on the foundations of my grandmother's cooking. Soft ricotta gnocchi in a bright, sweet pomodoro sauce. Tender osso buco that fell apart at the touch of a fork. Warm, crusty bread dipped in grassy olive oil. She started eating in the dining room instead of her bed. Then, she started taking walks in the garden. She began to smile again. But while Donatella was coming back to life, I realized someone else was haunting my kitchen. Silas. He worked late. The business of running a criminal empire didn't stop for the sun to go down. Often, around 2 in the morning, the heavy kitchen doors would swing open, and he would appear. He never wore a suit jacket at that hour, just a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal dark ink snaking up his muscular forearms, and a shoulder holster resting empty against his ribs. He looked exhausted. He looked dangerous. He looked incredibly lonely. He never asked for food. He would just sit at the massive marble island, pouring himself a glass of water, and watch me work. I was always awake, prepping for the next day, baking bread, braising meats, and every night, without asking, I would slide a plate in front of him. A simple bowl of cacio e pepe, a slice of cold roast beef on toasted sourdough with sharp mustard. He ate with a fierce, quiet intensity. He never said thank you, but the way his eyes tracked me as I moved around the kitchen was thanks enough. He watched the sway of my hips under my deep red apron. He watched the way I tasted the sauces with my grandmother's silver spoon. We existed in a bubble of silence and sustenance, but the tension between us was thickening, simmering just below the boiling point. It happened on a Tuesday, at 3 in the morning. I was simmering a rich, dark ragu for the following day's lasagna. The kitchen was warm, heavy with the scent of roasted tomatoes and red wine. I was exhausted, my hair falling out of its messy bun, my cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. Silas had been sitting at the island for an hour in total silence. I thought he was reviewing documents, but when I turned around to grab a pinch of salt, he was standing right behind me. I gasped, my back hitting the edge of the stove. He was so close I could feel the heat radiating from his massive chest. "You work too hard," Silas murmured, his voice a low vibration that traveled straight down my spine. "The sauce needs time," I whispered, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. He reached out. I thought he was going to touch my face. Instead, his large, calloused hand wrapped around my wrist. He gently guided my hand, which was holding the tarnished silver spoon, toward the bubbling pot. "Taste it," he ordered softly. I dipped the spoon into the red sauce. I brought it to my lips, blowing on it gently, and took a taste. It was rich, deep, and perfectly balanced. "It's perfect," I said, my voice trembling slightly. Silas didn't let go of my wrist. He stepped closer, crowding me against the counter. His dark eyes dropped to my mouth, lingering on the slight sheen of oil on my bottom lip. "Let me taste," he said, his voice a ragged whisper. He didn't take the spoon. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his gaze fixed on my lips. My breath hitched. The entire kitchen seemed to shrink down to the space between us. The dangerous mafia boss and the prep cook, the predator and the provider. He leaned closer. I closed my eyes, anticipating the harsh, demanding press of his mouth. I should have felt terrified of giving him that power. Instead, it felt like I had been starving my whole life, and he was the feast. Suddenly, a heavy knock echoed through the kitchen doors. Silas froze, his jaw clenched, a muscle ticking in his cheek. He stepped back, the cold air rushing into the space he had vacated. The spell was broken. He turned away, adjusting his cuffs, his face instantly reverting to the cold, merciless mask of Don Moretti. "Good night, Clara," he said, walking out the door without looking back. I stood there, trembling, clutching my silver spoon like a lifeline. The danger in this house wasn't just the guns or the rival families. The real danger was him. If you were falling for a dangerous man who could give you everything, but being with him meant living in the crosshairs of a mafia war, what would you do? Tell me below, his kitchen or my restaurant. Sheen Moore. Choose fast, because Clara's sanctuary is about to become a war zone. 2 days later, the outside world finally breached the walls of my kitchen. It was early morning. The estate was quiet. A delivery arrived at the service entrance, a special order of black winter truffles, a gift meant for Donatella to celebrate her recovered health. The delivery driver was new. He wouldn't look me in the eye, and he was sweating heavily despite the cool morning air. I signed the clipboard, my instincts screaming that something was wrong. I carried the wooden crate to the main prep island. The truffles looked perfect, dark, earthy, aromatic, but the smell, there was something beneath the heavy, musky scent of the fungus, something sharp. I pulled my grandmother's silver spoon from my pocket. I didn't need it to taste the truffles, but holding it centered my mind. It connected me to my palate. I took a small paring knife and shaved a microscopic flake off one of the truffles. I placed it on my tongue. My palate deconstructed the flavor profile instantly. Earth, oak, damp soil. And then, the finish. A harsh, metallic bitterness, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of bitter almonds. Cyanide. My eyes snapped open. A cold jolt of pure adrenaline hit my bloodstream. I spat the flake into the sink, rinsing my mouth frantically with cold water. It was such a tiny amount it wouldn't kill me, but if I had shaved those truffles over a plate of hot pasta, the heat would have released the poison, and whoever ate it would be dead in minutes. Someone had infiltrated the supply chain. Someone was trying to kill Silas. Or worse, they were trying to kill his mother to break him. At that exact moment, the kitchen doors swung open, and Silas walked in, flanked by 2 armed guards. He was dressed in a sharp gray suit, looking focused and lethal. "Clara," he said, walking toward the island, "my mother wants to thank you for everything. I'm taking her out to the garden. I want you to prepare something special for lunch. Use those." He reached out toward the wooden crate of poisoned truffles. "Don't touch them!" I screamed. I slapped his hand away with a violent crack that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. Instantly, the 2 guards drew their weapons, aiming directly at my chest. "Stand down!" Silas roared at the guards, his eyes locked on me. He didn't look at his stinging hand. He looked at my face, reading the absolute terror in my eyes. "Clara, what is it?" "They're poisoned," I gasped, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Cyanide, coated in something to mask the scent, but I tasted the bitter almond finish. Silas stared at me, the air in the kitchen turning instantly glacial. The handsome, tired man who sat in my kitchen at midnight vanished entirely. In his place was the dawn, the monster. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I am never wrong about what I taste," I said, clutching my silver spoon tightly. Silas turned to his men. "Lock down the estate. Nobody in, nobody out. Find the driver who delivered this. Bring him to the basement." He turned back to me. Without a word, he grabbed my arm, not gently, but with a fierce, protective grip, and pulled me toward the door. "Where are we going?" I asked, stumbling to keep up with his long strides. "The safe room," Silas growled. "They know you cook for us. If Lorenzo's family orchestrated this, they know you're the one keeping my mother alive. You are a target now." I should have felt panic at the realization that the Mafia wanted me dead. Instead, it felt like the final piece of the puzzle locking into place. I was no longer a prep cook in a basement. I was a player on a very dangerous board. Silas dragged me down a hidden staircase behind the library, leading to a subterranean bunker carved into the cliff rock. It was a sterile, heavily fortified room, stocked with weapons, monitors, and provisions. Donatella was already there, looking frightened but composed, escorted by Leo. "Stay here," Silas ordered, looking between me and his mother. "Do not open this door for anyone but me or Leo. Am I understood?" "Silas, please," Donatella whispered, clutching her rosary. "Be careful." Silas didn't answer her. He looked at me. His dark eyes searched my face, burning with an intensity that took my breath away. He reached out and cupped my cheek, his thumb brushing over my jawline. "I will come back for you," he vowed. Then he was gone, the heavy steel door sealing shut behind him with a deafening clang. For the next 4 hours, Donatella and I sat in silence. We watched the security monitors as chaos erupted upstairs. I saw heavily armed men storming the perimeter. I saw muzzle flashes in the garden. I saw the brutal, bloody reality of the world Silas lived in. I held Donatella's hand. I rubbed my thumb over the handle of my silver spoon in my pocket. I prayed, not to God, but to the ghosts of my grandmother's kitchen, to keep him safe. Finally, the steel door hissed open. Silas stepped inside. He was a terrifying sight. His suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was torn and splashed with dark crimson blood. His knuckles were bruised and split. He looked like a demon dragged straight out of hell. Donatella gasped, but Silas ignored her. He bypassed his mother entirely. He walked straight to me. He dropped to his knees in front of my chair, wrapping his massive, bloody arms around my waist, and buried his face in my stomach, right against the deep red fabric of my apron. "You saved us," he choked out, his broad shoulders trembling. "You saved her. You saved me." I didn't care about the blood. I didn't care about the violence. I ran my hands through his dark hair, holding him against me, anchoring him to the earth, just like my food anchored his mother. "I've got you," I whispered. "I'm right here." The threat was neutralized. Lorenzo's family had been purged, the traitor in the supply chain eliminated. The Moretti estate was quiet once again, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. It was dawn. The sun was rising over the ocean, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and pale gold. Silas and I stood on the massive balcony off the main dining room. He had showered and changed into a clean black sweater and dark jeans, but the exhaustion was still carved into his features. "My mother is safe," Silas said quietly, leaning his forearms on the stone balustrade. "Lorenzo is dead. The war is over." "For now," I said softly, looking out at the water. Silas turned his head to look at me. "Yes, for now. It will never truly be over." "This is my life, Clara. It is violent. It is ugly. And yesterday, it almost took you." He stepped away from the railing and stood in front of me. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy embossed envelope. He held it out to me. "What is this?" I asked, not taking it. "It's a deed," Silas said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "To a commercial property in the center of the city. Fully funded, $3 million in an operating account. It's yours." I stared at the envelope. "A restaurant?" "Your restaurant," Silas corrected. "You can cook whatever you want. No Chef Henri. No mafia bosses. No blood on the floor. You saved my family, Clara. This is your reward. You are free to go." I looked at the envelope. It was everything I had ever dreamed of when I was chopping vegetables in the windowless basement of Il Tartufo. It was freedom. It was respect. It was my name on a door. I looked up at Silas. His jaw was clenched so tight a muscle ticked violently near his ear. His dark eyes were carefully blank, masking the devastation I knew was churning beneath the surface. He was pushing me away because he thought he was poison. He thought he would ruin me. "You want me to leave?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I want you to be safe," Silas replied harshly. "You don't belong in this world, Clara. You belong in the light. You belong in a kitchen where the only thing you have to worry about is burning a sauce, not being poisoned by a rival capo. You don't get to tell me where I belong." I shot back, a sudden surge of heat flaring in my chest. "Clara, take the money." "No!" I yelled, slapping the envelope out of his hand. It fluttered to the stone floor between us. I stepped into his space, crowding the dangerous mafia boss against his own balcony railing. I didn't care about his power. I cared about the man who came to my kitchen at midnight seeking comfort. "You think you're protecting me," I sneered, pointing a finger at his chest. "But you're just being a coward. You're terrified because for the first time in your life, you care about someone other than your mother, and you don't know how to control it. Silas grabbed my hand, his grip tight, his eyes blazing with sudden, unrestrained fire. I am a monster, Clara. Everything I touch turns to ash. I am a chef, Silas, I screamed back. I take raw, broken, bitter things and I make them beautiful. Do you think I'm afraid of your dark? We stood chest to chest, breathing heavily, the wind whipping my hair across my face. I reached into the pocket of my apron, my fingers wrapped around the familiar, comforting weight of my grandmother's tarnished silver spoon. I pulled it out and held it up between us. My grandmother gave me this, I said, my voice dropping to a fierce, steady hum. She told me that food is a tether. It anchors people to the earth. It keeps them alive. I pressed the spoon flat against Silas's chest, right over his hammering heart. I am not leaving, I stated, setting my terms with absolute authority. I am not taking your restaurant. I am staying right here, in my kitchen, with your mother, with you. Silas stared at me, his chest heaving under my hand. The mask of the dawn was gone, utterly shattered. I will not be your employee, Silas, I continued, my voice unwavering. I will not be a prize you won, and I will not be a weakness you hide away in a safe room. If I stay as your equal. I stay as your partner. I should have felt intimidated demanding equality from a man who ruled a criminal empire. Instead, it felt like the only truth that mattered. Silas reached up and covered my hand, the hand pressing the silver spoon to his chest, with his own. His dark eyes softened, melting into a look of absolute, terrifying devotion. My partner, he whispered, testing the words like a sacred vow. Yes or no, Silas, I demanded. He didn't answer with words. He grabbed the lapels of my deep red apron, pulling me flush against his hard body, and brought his mouth down on mine. It was a kiss born of blood, starvation, and survival. It was desperate and demanding, tasting of coffee, danger, and absolute surrender. He devoured me, and for the first time in my life, I let myself be entirely consumed. I dropped the silver spoon. It clattered against the stone floor, coming to rest next to the discarded envelope containing $3 million and a dream I no longer wanted. I had found a new dream, and it tasted perfect. Would you have given up a $3 million restaurant to stay with a dangerous, devoted mafia boss? Make your final choice right now in the comments. His kitchen or my restaurant? Drop a like and subscribe if you want to see what happens when the rival families realize the Don's new wife is the most dangerous woman in the kitchen. See you in the next one.